Bit about myself, Keith Reesar. I'm an infrastructure architect with Red Hat. I also spent a lot of time coding, and that's what got me on this journey of how do I host all this stuff that I build, whether it's a tiny little nothing or whether it actually needs a lot of hosting resources and we really want it to be available. Not only do I code my own things, I spend a lot of time in the open source community, contributing to the code and the libraries I use and helping with their advocacy. So I think this is a great opportunity to continue more of the same. When we're looking at hosting, kind of that ultimate question is build versus buy. And I think more to it is a question of how are you going to trade money for time? I mean, there's so many options out there. And ultimately, you or your organization needs to make a decision of, well, how much am I going to do myself? Or how much am I going to find something that's turnkey? And there's a lot of implications down the road for how you make these decisions. So it's not necessarily an easy decision if you're looking at a larger app or something that's going to have longevity or something that's going to have change. So when I think about this, a handful of things I take into consideration, your technical capability. So maybe this is what you personally know or skills that your staff has. How much or what you're willing to invest in training yourself or training your staff or bringing on contractors. If your technical capability is very, very high and you already have it, it doesn't take a lot of runway to put together the right kind of applications or data services and get your web server, your application up and running. On the other hand, if you don't have that background, there's a lot to take into account, a lot of training or a lot of lead time necessary before you actually start getting value and before you can start doing what you really wanted to do in the first place. I assume that no one really wants to just get a server up and call themselves done. I mean, that adds basically no value. It's what happens after that. And what kind of skills do you have and how long would it take for you to skill up in that? So do you buy the skills or do you build them slowly? The other is, and this is starting to look out in the future a little bit then, day zero you can choose where you're hosting, but as your needs change, or maybe as the vendor changes, as they get more expensive, or as someone else has some fancy new bells and whistles and capability, you're going to want to think about vendor portability. How easy is it and what's the level of effort to move from one hosting vendor to the next? Maybe even give some conscious thought as to what might drive a move. Is it just how much you're paying every month, or is it how to accommodate growth, or is it how to mitigate the last outage you had? I mean, whatever scenarios might drive into it. The more you build, the more you understand all the parts of your hosting stack. Generally, the more portable you can be from one vendor to the next as you grow or as you change. On the other hand, the more you buy turnkey solutions, the more tightly integrated, the more tightly tied you might be into some of those solutions. So you want to look not at just day zero, but look forward into that 9, 12, 18-month range. I think when you get beyond 18 months, in the 18-month to 2-year range for most of the things that we'd be doing on a day-to-day basis, I mean, that's going to align with changes in architecture, changes in some other subcomponents anyways. So as long as you're investing in that, yeah, you can change from one provider to the next if you're tied into it heavily. So you do have these long-term, discrete periods of time when you have the opportunity to make those changes. It's not cost-free, but it's a lot easier to do than if you just up and decide, hey, I want to save $1,000 a month or $100 a month. Whatever amount is a significant amount of resources for your project. The last thing on that kind of general build versus buy as we're having this philosophical discussion is those eventual corner cases. So today, day zero, your app has no traffic. You have only a small bit of data. You don't have any technical debt in what you've actually built. But in time, as you get that data, as you get that traffic, as you built up all your technical debt, as you hack in one feature to the next, you find yourself in these corner cases. So that's this 9, 12, 18-month time frame. And the corner cases are things like, geez, I tied into a vendor's relational data store, and they won't let me have more than 10 million rows or a gig of data, and I'm beyond that. Oh no, what the hell do I do now, right? Or if you want to have access to the newest and the latest and the greatest feature because for some reason you require that, vendor doesn't offer that, okay, now I need to build it. some of those corner cases that you tend to run into, and be cognizant that as you're looking at your architecture, you can probably tell early on what those growth points are going to be and where you're going to be stressing one piece of technology or another, and be cognizant of it. Is that something that I want to build? Is that something that I can get away with buying so I can get moving very, very quickly and get on with the business of my business? So those are our philosophical questions of build versus buy. And I think that the ultimate build versus buy question is this idea of IaaS or PaaS. So infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. And so I've got a diagram here. I hope it pops up. I don't know how legible it is. But if you look at the left-hand column of infrastructure as a service as classically defined, the vendor takes responsibility for all the physical things. So the data center takes responsibility for the network, layer 2 network, takes responsibility for the physical servers and storage. And what you pay for, what you get, is a virtual machine of some sort, and you can go to town on that. You're responsible for patching it, making sure it's available. You're responsible for any dependencies needed to get your application up and running. You're responsible for bringing your data and making sure your data is backed up and it's not corrupted. You're responsible for scaling your application. You're responsible for making sure that there's no outage associated with any kind of planned or maybe unplanned maintenance. So a lot of burden falls on you inside IaaS. Contrast that with the classical PaaS paradigm, where the vendor's taking on a lot more responsibility. So it's all the physical stuff still, all the servers and stores and the networking and yada, yada, yada. But they're also going to take care of the operating system and the patching of such. They're going to take care of any dependencies for your application to get it running. What you're going to bring to the table is your data. You're going to bring your application, and hopefully you bring some traffic, something that's actually going to end up using it. That's your responsibility. And I think as we kind of go through some of these slides moving forward, we're going to see that these classical paradigms of what IaaS is, what PaaS is, they've changed and they've melded together a bit as some of these big cloud providers have advanced the number of services that they offer. But from a mindset, this is still a good place to start off and figure out what you actually want to take responsibility for. So what I'm going to do is during the course of this, I'm going to walk through three example use cases that hopefully kind of align to some of the things that you're thinking about, at least one of them, and put that through the paces of a couple of different IaaS scenarios and a couple of different PaaS scenarios. And again, question me, ask dialogue. I think we can all learn from what everyone else has already done, whether it's been successful or whether it's been less successful, if the latter, use an assumed name if you need to. But the three scenarios I got, the three use cases I've got, first is a simple blog. WordPress blog, it's got no resource consumption. You got a dozen posts before you gave up posting to it. Only your 10 friends ever read it. There's no revenue at stake. My personal blog, if I was to host one, would be called Keith's Blogs, Musings on My Hobbies of Beekeeping, Flying Airplanes, and Woodworking, but never all three at the same time. That's bad news. Don't want to have bees in an airplane. Second use case is a SaaS app I run called Appointment One. So this isn't really, it's got web, API front end, kind of variable traffic. It does not have a large data backend. There's bad copy and paste there. So there's not a ton of data there, but I want availability, and I want it to be very responsive when new traffic or new requests come in. And if it's unavailable, that affects revenue and makes it a little bit harder for me to pay for my house every month. So that's what I take into account with that second use case. The third use case is another website I run called emailformat.com. So this is a larger data app. It's got web and API front end. Traffic is pretty variable throughout the day and throughout the week. Weekend, it's got lower traffic, but it's got peaks during US daytime and peaks during daytime in Asia. Otherwise, it's got some troughs. So if you look at the bandwidth graphs, it does that kind of a thing. There's a ton of data in the back end, and that's something that's caused me pain as I've gone from one provider to the next over the years and seen their technologies change. If there's an outage, it doesn't affect revenue too much. I mean, most of my revenue, about 70%, comes from advertising. So if it's down for an hour, I don't owe SLAs or owe someone their monthly fee. I just lose a couple of bucks in advertising. So it's not absolutely tragic if there's an outage of some sort. So those are the three use cases what we'll be coming down to. First, talk about IaaS, classical IaaS. We looked at that stack. Folks who I put in this, I put these in three buckets when I think of IaaS. So I'm not talking vendor specific here. I mean, for the high level discussion we have here, they're all pretty much the same as soon as you categorize these. So in the top bucket, I've got your classic big public cloud. Everyone knows them and uses at least one of these vendors, I assume, whether it's AWS or Azure or Google Compute Engine. Tons of customers, tons of expertise, tons of resources. They actually have more than that IaaS paradigm, right? That's where they have so many different services that you can use, that you can buy. So you can really choose very granularly what you want to build and what you want to buy. So a lot more detail than that stacked diagram, that stacked model that we had. The next I'm calling that little public cloud. These are our VPS hosting. So you've got Linode, who's been around for 10, 15 years. They've just been around forever. You've got DigitalOcean, who's a bit newer, has good funding. DigitalOcean is going to support your Unixes and also your Windows servers. Vultr is someone that I've actually been using lately instead of DigitalOcean for some of mine. Again, it's going to do some Unix, some Linux. Much smaller customer footprint, much smaller footprint of capabilities, but it's still going to be IaaS. It's going to be on demand. It's some kind of virtual, flexible machine that you're working with. And then just to compare and contrast, the third category we have here is traditional classic physical hosting. So two vendors that I've used over the past handful of years, boy, it's impossible to read. Something called PhoenixNAP. There's a kind of a ghetto place called Joe's Data Center. I think they're out of Kansas City as well that I've used. So I think when you look at physical hosting and depending on your budget, depending on if this is just you guys or if you've got some real funding or real organization behind you, that physical hosting list gets much, much better. In a previous life, that's something that I sold at a much order of magnitude higher price point than those guys offer. But it ends up being a very similar feel, especially as we go through the analysis with our use cases today. So in looking at, put it in a simple table, and the way I wrap my mind around the different categories, the way I bucket these things together is first we're looking at those core services. And those core services, that's everything that was on that stack diagram of what IaaS is. So that's your storage, network traffic, whether it's local or public, and compute itself. And so each of these vendors has a slightly different take on how to deliver those core services. And that has a big impact as you're starting to do hosting with them and as you're projecting forward the cost of growth as far as what you need to invest in from a time and a technology and expertise perspective so you can handle that growth, or what you need to invest in from your pocketbook. So looking at top right corner there under core services, looking at servers, you're going to buy a fixed package. And this is a physical server of so much RAM, 32 gigs of RAM, maybe a terabyte of disk. You're going to choose the type of disk, whether it's spinning disk, solid state. You're going to choose how fast that disk might be. You're going to choose a certain type of processor and CPU. It's going to be this fixed package. I mean, this is a real physical thing sitting in this data center in Kansas City. Typically, as part of that fixed package, you're also going to buy network. Sometimes you can buy like a bucket of volume of network, so a terabyte or 5 terabytes a month. What I always saw was you're buying capability to use network. So you'll say you can use and eat all the network you want. It's a 10 megabit a second line speed, or 100 megabit, or a gigabit line speed. And use it, don't use it, whatever. It's a very static price model. You're not going to pay more than what you fix to on that package, whether it's a monthly fee or whether you sign a contract. Very predictable, everything that you're going to get. Next category there, looking at that VPS, looking at the DigitalOceans or the Vultrs, the Linodes, you're also going to find a fairly fixed package there. It's going to be access to CPU, disk, memory. Those are all going to be shared resources, as it's a virtual server, not physical. Those shared resources are going to be tied to a physical server. So there's not going to be high availability, you're moving resources like we might have with using VMware or some other more advanced hypervisor. So there's a risk of a noisy neighbor problem if folks are writing to the disk too much or using too much network. That can impact what you're actually doing inside that particular box. VPSs have matured a lot over the last handful of years, and I think the noisy neighbor problem is less of a concern for me now, and why I use those for some of my hosting. Less of a concern for me now than it had been in the past, with everyone having solid state disk and there's not oversubscription of resources. So I haven't noticed problems. It gives me a lot less heartburn. In general, from the network perspective on VPS, you're going to get with your package a bucket of transfer, 500 gigs a month or a terabyte a month, something like that. And if you go over it, then they can ding you for some overage amount. But largely, your financial exposure is capped inside the VPS. That's different, I think, than what we see with big public cloud, where everything's a la carte and everything tends to be metered. And there's some good and bad to that, but it's worth making a conscious consideration that everything is metered when you're in AWS or Google or the like. So you're going to buy a package that says, here's how much CPU RAM I've got. It's going to be fixed. It's going to be tied to a physical machine in general. Your storage I/O, anything that's not ephemeral, anything that's not local, will be metered as far as how much of it you use. But that also gives the opportunity to make the conscious decision of what kind of storage do I have, what kind of workload characteristics am I going to see, high I/O, low I/O, do I need it predictable, all kinds of decisions like that you can make either on day one, or you can make moving forward in the future as your application tends to run into challenges because it's driving the infrastructure too hard or driving your pocketbook too hard. The big difference is when you're looking at IaaS, kind of comes southbound from those core services, and that's where they've grown beyond just traditional IaaS. So there's the idea of these higher order services, so databases and traffic management, whether it's local or global traffic management, data processing, backup, all manner of different kinds of storage. This is where there's been so much investment and so much revenue from the big public cloud players, and that's a huge differentiator, a ton of capabilities that if you have your project and you build it tied to those higher order services, you can move really, really quickly. And for some reasonable versions of scaling, you can scale super easily without picking up additional expertise. Those higher order services, much in big public cloud, much like the core services, those are going to be metered based on actual utilization. As you use them more, you're going to pay more. For some apps, that works good. For others, there might be a high upfront cost to get your data processed or get things ready to start serving and delivering your application. The VPS services, they've started to add some of these higher order services. I'm not seeing them successfully deliver database hosting, but I am seeing them successfully deliver backups and load balancing, local traffic management. So they're getting in the game a little bit so they can take some of the responsibility, some of the burden off of you as an operator, but they're not going all the way in. And I don't see them ever investing to the degree that you'd see big public cloud. And they don't have the resources of the users or the user base, the customer base that is asking for that or willing to pay. Contrast that to your physical server. Think of that as the bad old days. None of that's available. Still, all you get is a server, anything on top of that. You're building yourself. Last thing they think of when IaaS is the integrations. What do you get or what do you have access to besides just that server? So at Joe's data center, you got nothing. You have this piece of metal. Maybe someone will run a cross connect for you to connect a couple of servers together, but that's really all that's happening. The VPSs have some integrations, and they'll have APIs that allow you to interrogate your servers, spin them up, spin them down, maybe take a snapshot. It's APIs that aligns to all of their basic capabilities. But where I see that as being really limited is if you're not programming to the API itself and you're using someone else's tool, someone else's kit, it's really limiting. So in my day job, I sell Ansible. And if anyone uses Ansible configuration management, one of the things they have there is you can pull down an inventory of all your servers or all your assets and do something with it. Well, big cloud providers, Amazon, Azure, and the like, all these tools are written so you can pull down all of your assets, your list of your servers, and your load balancers, and your databases, and do cool stuff with it. if you're using this low-cost VPS, that might exist, it might not exist, the amount of data you got. I think the same for some of the automation that you might run. There's just less testing of the API. So if your interaction with IaaS, if your interaction with the environment is tied tightly to being able to programmatically do everything, you move towards the left on that table. And you use something that's tried and tested and has just tons of capabilities. So whatever your tool of choice is, the cloud provider has the right hooks inside of it so you can make use. Big Cloud has all of that. They also generally have a marketplace. So as you're piecing different components together, you can buy additional capability and treat it like an appliance. Pay for it hourly usually. There's not going to be a upfront commit to that. So as you're kind of thinking of your overall architecture, that build versus buy, there's a lot more options, a lot more capability, hit the ground running when you're on big public cloud. So we look at that table and we look at our 3 use cases, some more toy than others, and certainly give me some feedback as far as if your use cases might sit somewhere else. That blog that no one's ever read, you can throw that in a VPS for like $5 a month. I mean, it's nothing. I think one of these guys, I don't know if it's DigitalOcean or Vault, or now they're doing hosting for $2.50 a month with a gig of RAM and a bunch of disk and things like that. I mean, it's a legit server you can do something with for just pocket change, price of coffee. It'll be a little bit more expensive if you're using big public cloud, but really it's not much. It's going to be relatively low cost. And that's because you're not using resources, you're not using various high availability capabilities, you're not anything that's metered, you're not running up those numbers at all. Our SaaS app, that I've looked around at how best to host that, and right now I ended up settling with running that on a number of VPS instances. It just made the most sense. That's composed of a bunch of small services that work together. A little bit cheaper than cloud, but I mean, more or less in the grand scheme of things, if there's any revenue associated with what you're doing, they're about the same price. When I projected forward with that SaaS app, I didn't see myself integrating tightly into a lot of the higher order services that Amazon would have. So I didn't see any upside to starting to use them and having that capability moving forward in the future. The last use case, that high traffic site, that's something that's been around for 10 years, and I've moved that a lot of different locations. And that's something I've moved as the site and the traffic grew and as the technology grew. So I have not hosted that ever in big public cloud. That always just felt too expensive compared to some of the other options. There was just, with the metering, there was just too much risk of all the traffic and all the I/O and how much that affected my monthly payment. Things weren't capped very well. I spent a lot of time hosting that on physical servers. I'd constantly change the physical servers, having multiple disks so a disk wouldn't fail, having multiple network connections so I wouldn't have an outage, upgrading the RAM, all kinds of things like that. Every time I ran into an outage, every time I ran into something being slow or a hotspot, I didn't feel comfortable ever hosting it there. And I think I would have seen the same whether I was at cheap Joe's data center or something that costs $1,000 or $10,000 a month. The idea is it's still like this physical piece of hardware that I've got some responsibility for. So whenever I have maintenance, everything can just go kaput for hours if I lose a hard drive or if I'm patching and I reboot and things don't come online. So I spent too much time worrying about that. So I was happy when some of the VPSs had upgraded their capabilities enough that I was able to move it back onto something that was virtualized so I'd have a little bit less responsibility. And actually in doing so, it had no impact on the cost of what I was paying. I wasn't paying more money to have less responsibility. It ended up being largely break even. So that's where I run that particular site right now. There's an exception to that. And so the site runs a large scan 2 or 3 times a year. And it pulls all this data from I think it's called the Open Crawl Index, basically a list of Google's entire cache that's public that you can scan through. So this website goes through that cache and extracts information. And that cache of data is hosted in Amazon S3, but you have to pay to get it. It's about 10 terabytes, so you're looking at several grand to pull that data down. But what Amazon says is, hey, if you process the data locally, we aren't going to charge you the transit. fee it all. So a few times a year, I spin up 100 hosts inside Amazon, chew on this data for 3 or 4 days, and then spin it down and then move the data back onto my VPS. So that ends up being the most economically viable thing. It's not steady state inside Amazon. It's for that discrete period of time when I'm doing some specific processing. And slight plug, use their spot instances. It's a broken marketplace, so you pay about 10% of rack rate for what you're running. It tends to work pretty good for at least that particular use case. So that's how I saw IaaS. And my background is kind of an infrastructure architect, sysadmin, things like that. I understand IaaS. I feel super comfortable getting in the command line, installing things, patching things, getting everything built up and running. And that's why I always thought PaaS was kind of a joke. I didn't see much value to PaaS until I spent a couple of years really working inside PaaS and understanding that, well, not only do a lot of people not want to get in and install Apache and configure it, but there's a ton of upside even if you know how to do that stuff as far as availability and time to market and how long it takes to get things working. Quick time check. How long? This is done at 10 after?
I believe so. It's 9:53.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So looking at PaaS, look at our stack there. Again, vendor takes on a lot more ownership of what's going on. What you're going to do is you're going to bring your data and you're going to bring your app. As long as you have the right kind of compatibility, everything is going to work. Vendor is going to take care of all the physical stuff, all the patching. They're also going to take care of routing your traffic and allowing you to scale out, horizontal scaling or scale up, vertical scaling. They'll allow you to do that for both high availability and to accommodate more traffic. So there's all these things you don't need to worry about at all. Super easy. I put the vendors for this, and actually it's kind of 3 buckets as well for this vendor. So big public cloud all have offerings to various degrees of maturity. I didn't think Amazon's PaaS was very mature. I've never used it, but it's never called out to me. But I know Google App Engine and Azure have very mature revenue-generating PaaS models. You look at folks who are focused just on PaaS, it's that second row. Possible to see in the bottom right, Heroku. I mean, they really started up the dedicated PaaS game. I think they're hosted on Amazon, but they've been around a long time. They've got a lot of capability, a lot of industry cred there. 2 other offerings there is Red Hat, OpenShift Online, Pivotal Web Services Online. Kind of truth in advertising here. I used to work at Pivotal. I currently work at Red Hat. What you get with these 2 PaaS offerings, I see these as almost loss leaders. This isn't something that those organizations run to make money. Instead, they use that to help with the brand, to show, hey, how easy it is, and look at our great capabilities, and we can kind of test out the code before we push it out for other people to use to make sure that it's stable and stable at scale. What those 2 organizations do and what those 2 products do are they're really focused on that bottom line, some kind of a dedicated single tenant model of PaaS. So in Red Hat's nomenclature, they have something called OpenShift. That's Kubernetes, Docker based. Pivotal sells their own version. There's upstream version called Cloud Foundry. It's in this same space. So those dedicated things are PaaS that you can run on top of physical servers. You can run on top of VPSs. You can run it on top of legit IaaS like big public cloud players based on your particular need. And once you get your PaaS available, then you can just give it your app. In looking at these, running a dedicated instance of these things isn't for the faint of heart. So if you don't want to deal with logging into a server and monkeying around with things, then you definitely want to go with something on that top row where someone is actually legitimately taking care of ownership of all those different categories that we have in gray there. If you pick from the middle row, if you pick from the bottom row where it's dedicated, the PaaS provides all that stuff in gray, but you got to install it and configure it and manage it the same as if you're dealing with an ordinary server. So take that for what it's worth, depending on if it's just you or if it's a large organization. You've got a split role of folks who are developers and operators and folks who are more infrastructure focused. Then by all means, have the infrastructure focused guys work on getting it installed and monitored, the PaaS installed and monitored and making sure it's usable. And then folks who are focused more on their apps, they can just deploy it inside of there. So looking at PaaS from this paradigm, looking at our three use cases again, our blog that gets no traffic. There's free tiers on everyone, on all these providers. That'll fit within that free tier. So you install the app, you deploy the app, and you probably never need to think about it again. So that's a real easy button there. If you go beyond just having a very small app that doesn't require much CPU or memory, or that doesn't require much in the terms of in a line of data, then you're going to be outside of that free tier, and you're quickly going to be exposed to recurring costs associated with the hosting. So with the SaaS app, two different ways. They are hosted. That's what I call anything that was in the Amazon, or the Pivotal Web Services, and the like. About $100 a month to get started with that, with a couple of different services running inside there and managing your data. Again, this SaaS app doesn't have a ton of data or a ton of traffic. We're focusing on just making sure that it's highly available and it's incredibly responsive. That's about the same out-of-pocket cost as if I was to do it myself with a VPS or with some kind of IaaS and then installing the software for a PaaS. There, it's a question of a burden of what you actually want to manage. I have a lot of expertise in the PaaS route, and I try to be very familiar with it. So I actually, that SaaS app, I host that inside a private PaaS for about $100 a month. The high traffic website, I've tried hosting that in the same private PaaS as the SaaS app, and that was a failure. Noisy neighbor problem there. It just didn't scale too well. I think if I was a legit organization, I had a lot more resources available towards me, that high traffic app would work just fine inside of OpenShift or Cloud Foundry or some other kind of PaaS. But I was trying to cut budgets, keep things relatively small, and that's where I noticed the pain of the overhead, the additional resources of having everything containerized, having multiple pieces of data here, all kinds of other services that weren't part of my core app. That additional overhead was just too much in my particular case. If I wanted to have someone else run the PaaS for that app, you're looking about $500 or so. I think that's a little bit more expensive than with IaaS. That breakdown is about $300 for just the network traffic. That site pulls 3 or 4 terabytes a month. So most of the money is just in paying for my network traffic, and then a couple $100 for 2 containers, dynamos. Each group has a different term for it. It's not particularly compute heavy. It always felt a little bit too expensive for me on the high traffic side. So I wasn't looking towards any kind of a hosting solution that would fit inside of there. So as it stands today, my blog doesn't exist because I just don't care about it enough. That SaaS app, I host that inside OpenShift, running on top of Vultr. That's my VPS of the week. I think they're just a hair less expensive or a hair bit more resources than DigitalOcean has. That high traffic site, I host that directly on a VPS. And that's how things have settled for the last better part of a year. Everything's been available and it's been able to grow. By using the PaaS for that SaaS app, which does get a ton of development, I'm able to push new code, and individual services can be automatically restarted, kept alive, rolled back. So I'm able to really grow the app, grow the capability without downtime. When I work with contractors, other employees who are doing it, they can, again, push the app without disrupting other portions of it. So that's a paradigm that worked really, really good. My high traffic website, I don't do anything with that. That's very passive. So I didn't need the additional capability that PaaS would have offered if it felt more economical. It's just so static. I just need some resources. And when you just need resources, you're not burning infrastructure down to the ground with each release or something more complex. There just isn't demand for it. And just a traditional limited scope IaaS gets the job done pretty quickly. So that's my quick tour of the hosting I've done over the last 5 or 10 years. What I saw with those use cases and what I've seen with myself and my own projects is pretty similar to what I saw when I was talking with customers, enterprise customers who were moving existing hosting from their data center to another provider, or who were starting up some new project, but they had funding, they had architecture, they had skills. There's a lot of resources available to them. They're making those exact same decisions. sometimes at a larger scale, sometimes they're taking into account other kinds of risk avoidance. For me, most of the risk avoidance is how much am I going to have to pay every month out of pocket for this? Is that going to equal the revenue I'm taking in? I think for a lot of other organizations, that risk avoidance is we can't be down, it'll hurt our brand, or compliance, we need to have compliance. That factors into the different vendors, and as we've seen, just like the vendors, the larger vendors are able to invest more in a wider portfolio of services. Those same vendors are able to invest more in a wider portfolio of support capabilities like compliance, audit compliance, and the like, which you may ultimately require. I've got a couple minutes left. Any thoughts or questions?
And it actually goes till quarter after, so we got about
Oh, good.
a little over 10 minutes. Yeah.
Back.
Well, I assume you have considered scalability when making that decision, where to host your app or, website or whatever. I'll give you an opportunity to make your beekeeping video go viral. Right? So you host it in one infrastructure, let's say, cloud, not necessarily. The other one, it goes viral. Now you're moving from one infrastructure to other. How challenging it is to, kind of move your system from one to other to keep up with the, scalability issues.
And so repeat the question for that, so I assume everyone else heard it, is how quickly can you respond when there's traffic needs that come in that might drive you to change part of your architecture, part of your hosting provider, so that you can continue to provide the service. Comes down to the capability that you have, right? So if you're in that PaaS model and you're not doing it on a shoestring budget like I often am, and you have tons of resources there, you can push a button and scale, or you can have automatic scaling built in. For a while, I was hosting a high traffic site inside of PaaS, and I would get crawlers that came on, and I got a denial of service attack at one point. I was able to automatically scale up and handle 15 times more traffic than normal until my couple of boxes ran out of resources. So that's the real easy button, is if you can have enough Slack infrastructure there, or use the automation that Amazon and Azure and the like have to automatically scale out, then you're in good shape. The more you take ownership yourself when you're on that VPS, or if you're in your Joe's data center, you're on your own and you are really fighting a fire there, aren't you? You might get someone to spin up another server, but that's not going to scale. That gives you 2x, not a magnitude more. It doesn't get you 10x. And that's where you need, if that's ever going to happen, go with big cloud, because that's already built in. So you're not reacting within a handful of minutes or hours. Longer term, days, weeks, yes, you can move, re-architect, do other things, but it's in that minutes to hours time frame. You need to have that capability natively, don't you?
Sure, yeah. It's more like VPS to cloud or cloud to VPS, vice versa. So you anticipate your scale of it, you will be, you'll expect more traffic and stuff like that, but later, didn't work out the way that you thought. So you wanted to move to VPS. So I was looking like how easy and how challenging it is to move from one type of infrastructure to the other.
And my experience as far as the difficulty of moving from VPS to public cloud and back again, I build everything myself. So I didn't think that's what was challenging, because I'm not tied into those higher order services.
Sure.
If you're already on VPS, then you're largely building things yourself. And if you have the need to move to big public cloud, that should be relatively easy. I mean, it's the same infrastructure that you're ultimately looking at, just bigger and more scalable. But if for some reason you wanted to downsize capabilities, then you're looking at recoding or re-architecture or other things if you tied into those higher order services. So as you look at your long-term roadmap, if there's ever going to be an idea where you say, I thought this website was going to take off and be hugely successful, so I hosted it on Amazon, but it's not doing it, it's just steady state, I want to bring it back down. Oh wait, but I tied into RTS and some of their RDS and some of their pipelines. That's going to take some coding. So do I want to spend time coding or paying a developer to code, or do I want to pay that monthly reoccurring cost? So upfront decisions. To be honest with yourself of how long you want to keep something alive and what does life support actually look like for it.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just did. Thank you.
So, when you lay this out this way, I think, your expertise belongs to the infrastructure as a service kind of world, et cetera. But it seems like the platform as a service is probably growing, expanding, getting better, getting cheaper. All those things are happening. So what happens to guys like you with all that expertise if people are migrating toward the platform as a service?
I think that's the right way to go. If you look, and the question is, what happens to us infrastructure guys when the future comes up and the future is PaaS? That's the way the industry is moving, is having more automation, more repeatability, more things built in. So that's the right direction to go. Whether your app and your capability makes sense to roll that automation yourself or you want to get it somewhere else, the same thing's going to happen. You're going to have less thought and focus on a server or a hard drive. So few people care about that these days. So either way, you're kind of moving up the value chain. It's whether you're building that value chain, right? If you're building the automation that gives you the value, or you're buying it more than anything else. So everyone's just as relevant as long as you're moving up from that core infrastructure. In most cases, I don't want to be insensitive, but I think in most cases that infrastructure is less important now than it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago when I was selling it.
And do you see a difference with those three, Azure, AWS, Compute Engine? What's going on up there at that level? Do you have any opinions about those three, or is that just, in terms of...
Do I have opinions or feedback on differentiation between big public cloud, Azure, AWS, Google? I'll say no opinions on that one. They each have their advantages. They're investing a lot. So it's what other dependencies you might have that may make one more attractive than another. I think their prices are all largely the same. The capabilities are relatively similar too. So if you're coming in something greenfield, you don't have a whole lot of dependencies, there's a lot of similarities. So it's whatever preference you can pick up, it's probably the right decision. If you're a much larger organization, you have commercial things in place. If you need certain connectivity, you need certain compliance, then there's maybe more due diligence that you can do, and something might look a little bit different.
Okay.
But I'd say no opinion for that. I don't want to be too vendor specific. Yeah.
So I'm not going to try to be a shill for Joe's data center. I run a managed services company that caters to agriculture and land industrial. We do a lot of BDI, and we actually do all of our co-location now in Joe's data center.
Oh, and literally in Joe's data center. Okay.
I'm in Kansas City.
So I was right.
Yeah, no, I go to Kansas City at least once a month, and visit the guys down there. It's a great team. They're supportive, extremely responsive. I'm sure every other colo provider is the same, because we also deal with the 511 building. They're very responsive team here on campus. But I know that your talk was mostly focused around building an app, and hosting an app, and making an app work. But for us, I think going backwards to that kind of physical hardware where we have complete control, because then we pay them a bunch of money, we have a bunch of servers there, and you can do all the VMware clustering and things that you want to do, but it's unmanaged and you have to build it yourself. I mean, they'll provide connectivity and the means to put the hardware there and do it, but you are really on your own. But you want that high availability, so I mean, it is there.
You have to build it yourself to some degree. Absolutely. And what I saw when I was selling hosting is if you have steady state workload, or if you're just really focusing on a server and what's built on top of it, any kind of co-location or kind of physical hosting ends up being really economical if you have access to the resources. On the other hand, if you're using APIs and programmatically scaling out or burning down instances all the time, then something like big public cloud or VPS makes economic sense. But if you're steady state in the cloud, you're not using any higher order services, you're not taking advantage of really what they have to offer from a pure pocketbook perspective, colo or physical server at Joe's data center or the like is absolutely a clear winner if those are the specific things that you're looking at. So again, that day zero planning, what do you have access to?
I got somewhat of a follow-up to that, but I guess the question is, does it make sense at some point where if you're using like VPS pretty heavily, if you scale up to a certain point, does it make sense to move to more physical? Or, I guess, are you familiar with kind of where that tipping point is, where VPS you've kind of outgrown?
It absolutely does make sense to go from, at some point, VPS down to some physical servers of some sort. When you look at the size of the server, if you need more than, I'd say 8 gigs of RAM or so, then the VPSs tend to become far more expensive. And I don't know if that's inside their commercial model, if they're doing some oversubscription and that's where things tend to get non-linear, or if that's just when it starts to feel more expensive on a per server basis, looking at the rack rates that they have. But at that point, the overhead of your physical server, the colo space, yada, 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 it ends up being cheaper dollar for dollar to get a certain amount of resources. But you don't want to do that with just one server. If you're doing that with just one server to go from $150 a month or $100 a month, looking on the budget side of things like I did with that website, I wasn't up at night, but I had stress when things were breaking or when I needed to do some kind of maintenance. So, okay, I'll pay the extra money not to have that stress, but when I've got the equivalent of 5 physical servers or 10 physical servers, I can start sharing the load or doing my own virtualization, then absolutely go down and do that. It ends up pocketbook-wise being far less expensive, and if you have the support and capabilities around to take care of that underlying infrastructure, then it's a good direction to go, as long as you don't need to respond to your question, right? That scaling event where you're really tied into what you own and what you have, and you're not going to respond in minutes to hours to dramatically improve or increase capacity. Yeah.
How about hosting it yourself?
Hosting it yourself?
Yeah.
In your basement, in your office?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could probably find some internet service that has some kind of reliability guarantees, and then try, like, I mean, I have this Chromebook here. It's cheap. It doesn't use a lot of power. If my needs are relatively low, I mean, maybe I can even like buy 10 of them and have a Chromebook server farm. Hardware. Not a lot of power needs. I know, what do you think? Do you have any idea?
Question is, what about doing it yourself instead of having some service provider in the mix,
Yeah.
whatever level it might be?
Yeah.
If your availability doesn't require it, if you've got maybe larger, but the equivalent of that blog, where if it's down, it's no big deal, and you have the capability and you can make the CapEx investment in buying your 10 Chromebooks, then I guess that could be viable. It's not something that I've ever considered, and it might be because I've been in the business so long that I just think, oh, that's too unreliable. You need multiple power feeds and multiple network feeds. You need to have all this redundancy at some level. So I haven't personally considered it, whether it's a hobby project in my basement or whether it's in the corporate office. It just doesn't feel reliable enough. But I think I've got a chip on my shoulder there, and I think others might have different opinions on whether that's viable or not.
There's also a legal issue. What agreement do you have with your internet provider at home? Your average cable modem, you're not actually allowed to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it probably also doesn't have to the availability guarantees that you would use for something like that. But I mean, you can certainly get like a business internet plan from Comcast or whoever that would let you do that for you.
All right, well, not to cut it off, but we've got 5 minutes before the next session starts, so let's give Keith a little.
Thank you, guys. Great to open up mini bar with individual sessions, and have a great rest of your day. Is your podium next?
It sure is.
All right. Everything just worked for me, so
Yeah, I came in earlier and there's a little dongle here that they normally don't have, and it pleases me greatly. So
how you doing?
normally you have to do public murder to get one of those here.
There is, it's just as public is what I'm using. So it just popped up on my phone and there was no question about, it's slow though. It's not as responsive as you'd like it to be probably.
All right. Yeah, it's some of the rooms like.
Oh, really?
My own phone.
Yeah, you know, it's my first time through here today too, so I'm kind of learning on the fly.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So they want you to make sure you have the mic on.
Awesome.
Tape and everything, I'll introduce you.
Cool. I'm James.
Yeah, I guess I'm Tom Monson. As a matter of fact, I think I connected to you.
Yeah, I think you reached out on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so I'm glad I got this room. So
Yeah. All right.
I get to listen to your talk.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully participate in the talk. It's intended to be a little bit of back and forth.
Good. I hope so. Those are the best candidates when everybody's talking. That's all right. Don't worry. This is just as good.
What session were you just in?
Machine learning.
Cool. How,
It was good for me. For me, Michelle was there, and some good basics on how it works and some good tools. What was yours? Oh yeah, what was that? Yeah, Aaron's was pretty good.
I have no idea if this thing is on.
It is.
Okay. / recording. It gave me a slanted podium, so not great, Bob. Yes, can I have you take a knee? Such a rowdy bunch here, guys. Come on. There it is. What? Yes, down in one. Drop a penny in it. You've been there. You know me. My inner academic came out, and that I had to add a super title to it instead of just leaving it at the really concise reality-based hiring.
Well, but here we are. The subtitle.